Tonight, we travel deep into the mountains of Appalachia to a hollow where fog never lifts, and where the living once feared to speak the name of the man who dug his own grave. This is the record of Ephraim Cole, the grave digger of Clay Hollow, whose shovel never struck empty ground. In the fall of 1897, when the first frost licked the ridges of West Virginia, a man was seen digging a grave behind his house. No funeral had been announced. No bell had rung, but he worked as if he were hired by death himself, each shovelful deliberate, every strike echoing across the valley. Neighbors watched from a distance, too afraid to ask who it was, for by the third day, he had carved a pit 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and deep enough that the earth seemed to swallow the light. He stood at the edge for hours, murmuring scripture, though no church claimed him, and no cross marked his faith. When winter came, his house was empty, the hearth still warm, and the shovel leaning upright in frozen ground. The grave, they said, was filled, but not by any man's hand. The land in its silence. Clay Hollow sat miles from any proper town, tucked between the Elk River and the dark shoulders of Birch Mountain. The people who lived there did not build their homes, they endured them. Cabins clung to the mud like scars. The forest pressed in tight, its trees gnarled and blackened from old lightning strikes. At night, the hills themselves seemed to breathe the air heavy with damp pine, smoke, and sorrow. It was a place that forgot things, or perhaps chose to. Ephraim Cole had lived there all his 43 years. He was the son of a preacher and a midwife, born in the year 1854. Baptized in creek water dark as ink, he had buried more people than he could name. For in the hollows of Appalachia, death was a neighbor, not a stranger. Folks said Ephraim could dig a grave faster than any 2 men together. He never whistled, never sang, only paused, now and then, to look at the sky as if timing his work to something unseen. Children whispered that he could hear the ground breathing. By 1897, the mines had gone quiet. The timber men had moved on, leaving the valley hollowed like a carcass picked clean. Those who stayed learned to live on memory, and memory in those hills was rarely kind. The widow's ghost. Ephraim had not always been alone. He once had a wife, Ruth. She was a seamstress from Sutton, known for her hymns and her quiet smile. They married in 1890, when the sawmill was still running and the church still had a preacher. But by the spring of 95, a fever swept through the valley, the kind that burned through the lungs and left the eyes red as coals. Ruth took sick in April. By May, she was gone. Ephraim dug her grave himself, 3 feet deeper than regulation. When the undertaker asked why, Ephraim replied, "The deeper the rest, the further from the call." From that night on, he slept with his boots by the door, as though waiting for someone to come knocking from beneath the earth. Neighbors would find him standing at her grave in the small hours, lantern light trembling against the stones. He'd mutter prayers not to God, but to her. One boy swore he heard him say, "If you can hear me, Ruth, I'll come down to you soon." The town's unease. Clay Hollow was not a place for questions, but after Ruth's death, Ephraim began to change. He stopped attending service, stopped shaving, spent whole days measuring the earth behind his cabin, pacing, counting, marking lines with chalk. The postmaster said he'd come into town one morning, asking for ledgers and ink, not for keeping names, he said, for keeping time. That summer, a handful of graves near the old cemetery began to sink, not collapse, just breathe. The soil would rise and fall as though stirred from beneath. When the groundkeepers tried to fill them, they said they heard a hollow sound, like air escaping from lungs. The widow Maybelle called it the return. She said, "The dead remember their measure, and the one who dug their rest must one day lie in his own." The night of the lanterns, the first true sign of something unnatural, came on an October night. 3 men were walking home from the tavern. A logger named Boone, A farmer called Harlan and the pastor Reverend Crane. They saw lights in the fog. Up by Ephraim's cabin, not one, but 3 lanterns moving in a slow, circling dance. Boone swore he saw figures shapes like shadows against the mist. Rising from the ground, Harlan said the air smelled of iron, like fresh blood. Reverend Crane, who was the only sober one among them, described it later in his journal. The fog was thick as milk. Through it, I glimpsed Mr. Cole standing beside a pit, whispering to it. I called his name, but he did not answer. He only looked up, lantern in hand, and smiled as though greeting an old friend. I could not see who stood beside him, but there were 2 sets of footprints when we approached. By dawn, the lights were gone. Ephraim's cabin was locked, and the earth behind it looked freshly turned. Weeks passed. Then one morning, the county clerk found a small brown parcel on his desk, no name, no return. Inside was a ledger. Its cover was worn smooth, edges blackened as though singed. The first page bore a single line, written in trembling hand, "To whom it may concern. These are the measurements of my final work." The entries began months before Ruth's death, detailed accounts of each burial, name, date, dimensions, soil depth. Then, midway through 1895, something shifted. The names stopped. The numbers remained. July 6th, 6 feet long, 2 feet deep. Not enough. July 7th, 7 feet. Still shallow. July 9th, 8 feet. Dreamed of her voice again. Says she is cold. By August. The writing grew erratic, entire pages of scratches, circles, and biblical verses written backward. The last entry, dated October 11th, 1897, simply read, "Measured the ground. It matches me now." Reverend Crane, shaken by the ledger, decided to confront Ephraim one final time. He brought along Boone and the sheriff, Samuel Tate. They arrived at the cabin near dusk. Mist curling low over the fields. No answer. Through the window, they saw him sitting at the table, a candle burning low, hands folded as if in prayer. When they broke the door open, the chair was empty. Only the candle remained. Its wax melted into the shape of a handprint. On the wall, scratched into the wood, were 7 words. "The ground remembers who dug it." Behind the cabin, the grave waited, perfect, smooth-edged, lined with cedar boards. Inside, there was a pillow of white cloth and a single hair ribbon. Ruth's. The sheriff ordered the cabin sealed. Reverend Crane kept the ledger, though he would never speak of it again. In his final sermon before leaving Clay Hollow, he said, "Some men dig not for the dead, but for what the dead might say." That winter was cruel. Frost cracked the windows, and the valley went silent. By spring, Ephraim was gone. No trace, no sign of struggle, just his shovel, standing upright in frozen soil, as if marking a headstone that wasn't there. When the thaw came, the grave behind his cabin was filled, fresh earth. No footprints. Years later, travelers who passed through Clay Hollow claimed they could hear something when the wind shifted, a rhythmic sound beneath the soil, like metal scraping stone. Children said it was Ephraim, still digging, still measuring, still answering the call that came from under the ground. The few who dared visit his land said the dirt there never stayed flat. Each autumn it swelled and sank. Like breathing. And though no one has found his bones, old folks still swear that when the moon hangs low over the ridge and the fog gathers thick, you can see a lantern moving through the trees. Slow, steady, deliberate. Measuring the earth. They say every man's work defines him. For Ephraim Cole, the work was never done. And if the grave he dug was meant for himself, then perhaps it finally found him. When a man disappears in the mountains, the land keeps what it's owed. Sometimes it gives a little back, a whisper, a footprint, a dream. But in Clay Hollow, what the earth returned was not mercy. It was memory. The winter after Ephraim Cole vanished was long and strange. Snow came early and thick. Laying over the hollow like a shroud. The road to town froze solid. Even the crows stopped calling. Folks said it was the quietest Christmas they'd ever known. Reverend Crane had left by then gone north to Charleston. His nerves gone bad. The new pastor, a young man named Ellis Ward, took over the church. He found the congregation small, frightened, and unwilling to speak Ephraim's name. They only called him the Digger. Every Sunday, the pews grew emptier. The choir stopped singing by January. And by March, when the thaw came, the ground behind Ephraim's cabin had changed. 2 boys, Tom and Jesse Miller, were the first to see it. They'd been trapping rabbits near the property line when Jesse tripped over what looked like a mound of earth. Except it wasn't a mound. It was a sinkhole, small but perfect, like a breath drawn inward by the earth itself. At the center of that hollow, something glinted, a small square of glass. Tom reached for it, but Jesse stopped him. He said he heard something, like a voice. It was whispering under the dirt. Jesse told his father later, sounded like it was a skin for a name. The boys ran all the way home. By the next morning, half the town had heard their story. By evening, not a soul would walk past that property, not even by daylight. 2 months later, Reverend Crane returned to Clay Hollow. He came unannounced, his clothes travel-worn, his eyes hollowed from fever and drink. He carried a single suitcase and a wrapped bundle, the ledger. He'd spent the winter poring over it, trying to decipher Ephraim's scrawled numbers and backward verses. What he found, he said, was not madness, but a map. The ledger's margins contained faint sketches, crude outlines of the valley, the river bends, the ridges. And at the center, always marked by a cross, was Ephraim's cabin. But there were other markings, 2 smaller X's, scattered across the hills, each one, when compared to county burial records, aligned with a grave Ephraim had dug himself. Crane believed the man had measured not just depth, but time, that each grave was part of a pattern, a clock of the dead, winding toward something unseen. He told no one at first, not until he heard what had happened to the Miller boys. That summer, 1898, the sound returned. Late at night, those who lived near the old cemetery claimed to hear the unmistakable rhythm of a shovel, steady, methodical. Always in threes. Thunk. Prop. Pause. The sheriff dismissed it as foxes or drifters, but when a hunter followed the sound one night, he came back pale as bone, muttering that he'd seen a lantern moving underground. Within weeks, graves began to sink again, not collapse, but shift. The soil turned darker, slicker. And when one coffin was exhumed to investigate, they found it empty. Only the impression of a body remained, as if the earth had taken back what was once inside. Reverend Crane returned to the cemetery with the ledger in hand, searching for answers. By candlelight, he compared the names in the book to the headstones before him. When he reached Ruth Cole's grave, he stopped. The stone was split in 2 and carved into the broken half as if by a knife were the words. The Reverend began keeping his own record. Fragments of that journal still survive in county archives. Though most pages were burned, the following passages remain legible. June 2nd. The air around the Cole property feels charged, like the pause before lightning. The ground hums beneath my boots. The ledger speaks of numbers I cannot place. 6, 7, 8, then 1 again. Perhaps cycles? June 9th. Dug near the cabin. Found boards under the soil. Old coffin wood. Fresh cut, no rot. Inside hair not human. Animal perhaps, yet braided like a woman's. June 10th. Heard a voice tonight. Not Ruth's, not Ephraim's, it said my name. I am certain of it. June 14th. Sleep brings no peace. I dream of being measured head to toe by hands that are not there. One morning, a stranger arrived in Clay Hollow. He said he was from the railroad company sent to survey the land for expansion, but locals knew better. He Asked too many questions about Ephraim Cole. Knew too much about graves. He introduced himself as Mr. Alcott and took a room at the boarding house. At night, he'd walk toward the hills, carrying surveying tools that looked suspiciously like coffining rods. Mrs. Maybell, the widow who kept the inn, claimed she saw him speaking to someone in the fog, though no one else was there. She said he held up a small mirror, as if waiting for it to answer. The next morning, Alcott was gone. His room stood empty, the bed unslept. But on the desk lay a note written in hurried hand, measured wrong. Depth reverses. Tell Crane the ground opens inward. No trace of him was ever found. The smell of iron by midsummer. The hollow began to stink of iron and rot. Wells turned red, as if rust had bled into the veins of the valley. Livestock refused to graze near the cemetery, and the fog, that same milk-white mist, never seemed to lift. Reverend Crane, desperate for answers, returned once more to Ephraim's cabin. The door still bore the words carved. Years before, the ground remembers who dug it. Inside, everything was just as he'd left it, except for one thing. The candle on the table was burning. And beside it lay a new entry in Ephraim's ledger, written in a fresher ink. August 3, 1898. Heard her through the roots. The ground is thinner now. Soon I will see the bottom. Crane stared at it for hours before realizing what chilled him most. The handwriting wasn't Ephraim's. It was his own. The following Sunday, the congregation gathered as usual. Halfway through service, the floorboards began to tremble. At first, they thought it was thunder. Then they heard it. The shovel. 3 strikes. Pause. 3 strikes. Pause. Coming from beneath the church. Crane ordered everyone out. When they returned hours later with lanterns and spades, they tore up the floor and found a hollow space below the altar. Inside was a pit 6 feet deep, freshly dug, cedar line. And at its bottom, a single item, a wedding ring. The Reverend fainted when he came to. He ordered the church boarded up. Within the week, he was gone from Clay Hollow again. He would never return. Years later, a packet of unsent letters was found in the rectory attic, all written by Crane, addressed to someone named E.K. Scholars assume Ephraim Cole, though by then, Cole had been missing over a decade. The letters reveal the full depth of Crane's torment. You told me the earth breathes, and I laughed. But I hear it now, Ephraim. I hear her voice when it rains. She says you measured wrong, that the grave was never yours. I dreamt of your lantern again. It was beneath the floor. The flame burned blue. When I woke, the earth beside my bed was damp. They think you're dead, Ephraim. But I know better. The ground doesn't kill what it keeps, it changes it. By 1901, only a handful of families remained in Clay Hollow. Floods had taken most of the valley, washing out the cemetery road. Those who stayed said the land felt different, spongy, like skin stretched over something alive. An old woman named Cora Hensley was the last to see anything of Ephraim Cole. She told her granddaughter years later, there was a fog that night, thicker'n I ever saw. I was fetchin' water when I saw him, standin' by the river. Looked just the same hat, same coat. He was diggin', but the dirt weren't fallin' down, it was fallin' up. Like the earth didn't want it. He looked right at me and said, "It's near done now. The ground's ready." Then he walked into the fog, and I never saw him again. In 1902, a mining company began blasting near the ridge. Their dynamite unearthed part of the old cemetery. When workers uncovered the site, they found coffins stacked like ribs, each one turned upside down. In the center was a single, massive pit too deep to measure. The foreman reported that the walls of the pit were carved smooth, lined with cedar planks, and that the bottom seemed to hum like a hive. No one stayed long enough to see more. The mine was abandoned within weeks. To this day, locals say that if you strike the ground near the ridge, You can hear a hollow echo as if there's still something down there. Waiting. A grave is supposed to be an ending, a full stop in the sentence of a man's life. But for Ephraim Cole, it was a door. Some say he dug his way down to his wife. Others believe he simply went mad from grief. But in Clay Hollow, where the fog never lifts and the soil never settles, they say he's still digging, not for death, but for the thing beneath it. By the turn of the new century, Clay Hollow was almost gone. The mines had closed. The river had changed its course, but stories travel farther than rivers. And the tale of the man who dug his own grave began to creep beyond the hills. It reached Charleston first, then Lexington, then further south, carried by traders, by letters, and by the kind of fear that never needs proof. In 1903, a state surveyor named Henry Keller arrived in Clay County to document abandoned settlements. He wasn't a believer, not in ghosts, not in curses. He was a man of ledgers and maps, hired to draw straight lines through crooked country. But while cataloging an old courthouse cellar, he found something odd. A parcel wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with wax, marked only EC. Inside were yellowed sheets of paper sketches of hills, numbers scrawled beside what looked like graves, and a single line written across the bottom: "The earth is measured by the dead, not the living." Keller thought it was some madman's rambling, until he overlaid the sketches with his own maps. The points matched perfectly with known burial grounds across 3 counties. Each one fell in a spiral, winding inward toward a single unmarked spot, Clay Hollow. Keller rode there in late September. Alone, locals warned him not to linger after sundown. But he laughed it off. He carried survey rods, a compass, and a journal. The air grew colder the deeper he went. The trees bent toward the road as though eavesdropping. He found the remains of Ephraim Cole's cabin. Just as twilight bled into the hills, no walls stood, only the stone hearth, moss-covered and slick with dew. The ground around it had collapsed inward, like a mouth yawning in sleep. He set up camp 50 yards away and began sketching by lantern light. That was when he heard it, the unmistakable rhythm of digging. Faint but steady, thunk, scrape, pause. He called out. No answer. When he held the lantern toward the sound, he saw only the shimmer of fog, and just beyond it, what looked like footprints leading straight into the ground. Keller's journal. 1903. Fragments of his journal survive in the state archives. The ink is shaky, words fading at the edges, but the tone grows more desperate with each entry. September 26th. The ground moves at night. Not wind, not quake. Feels hollow beneath my feet, as if something is shifting underneath. September 27th. Found wooden boards buried in perfect circles. Measured 1. Exactly 6 feet 3 inches my own height. Sep 28. Dreamt of a man whispering from a pit. He said, "Measure the living, bury the sound." Sep 29. My compass spins. The soil breathes. I hear her name, Ruth Cole, carried on the wind. I am leaving at dawn. He never did. When a search party came weeks later, they found his tent torn, his maps scattered, only his boots remained. Side by side at the edge of a freshly turned patch of earth. Word of Keller's disappearance reached the University of Virgin. A historian named Professor Lucinda Gray became obsessed with the story. She believed the graves followed something older than Christianity, a geomantic design, perhaps an ancient Appalachian burial alignment echoing Druidic practice. In 1904, she published a pamphlet titled The Cole Pattern, Mapping the Sleep of the Dead. She proposed that Ephraim had discovered an underfield, a network of natural caverns that hummed at specific frequencies, frequencies that could disturb human thought. Madness, her peers called it. Yet Gray gathered a small team, 2 students and a photographer, and ventured into Clay Hollow that Autumn to prove her theory. None returned. Months later, a trapper found their camera near the riverbank. The last photograph showed a blur of mist shaped almost like a face, half buried in the soil. When developed, the image carried faint scratches around the edges, marks that, when traced, spelled EC the miners' road. By 1905, a new mining company reopened the ridge. Ignoring the local warnings, their drills reached a layer of rock unlike any they'd seen, smooth, gray, almost polished. When they tried to break through, the drills seized and the shafts filled with an unexplainable hum, low and steady, like a heartbeat. Foreman Jonas Dale kept a log. March 11th, hit a void at 43 feet. Sounded like wind rushing up, but there's no draft. Some men say they heard voices. Told them it's gas. March 12th, voices clearer now. Counting. 6, 7, 8, 1. Repeating. March 13th, ground gave out. Lost 3 men. Pulled one body up, skin covered in soil lines. Like the earth had drawn on him. The mine closed the next day. They sealed the shaft with concrete and posted guards for a year. Still, at night, locals claimed they could hear knocking from beneath the ridge. 3 slow strikes. Then silence. A decade later, during road construction, engineers rediscovered Keller's map. It had been copied and re-inked, its edges marked with notes in different hands. Someone, perhaps the mining foreman, perhaps another surveyor, had added new coordinates, extending the spiral even further outward. When plotted, the graves formed not just a spiral but a perfect circle. Miles wide. At its center sat the ruins of the church Reverend Crane had boarded shut. And beneath that, according to the last annotation, a phrase written in bold black: the measure is complete. No one ever dug there again. The church collapsed in 1912, swallowed by a sinkhole. All that remains is a patch of stone and the faint outline of a doorframe leading nowhere. In 1918, a crate from Clay County arrived at the State Museum. Inside were the remains of the coal ledger, pieces of Keller's notes, and a shovel head recovered from the ridge. Curators placed them on display under local superstitions. Soon, the guards complained. They said the exhibit whispered at night, faint, rhythmic, like someone counting or praying. One janitor swore he saw fresh dirt under the display case every morning. Though no one had touched it, the museum sealed the artifacts in storage in 1920. They've never been displayed since. Records show the box was moved 3 times, each time after a security guard reported sounds from within the crate. That same year, a local newspaper received an anonymous envelope postmarked from a town that no longer existed, Birchmouth. Inside was a letter, written in elegant, old-fashioned script. The graves are not for men but for moments. Each one holds a second of time, buried to keep it from repeating. But someone dug too deep, and now the seconds are leaking. No one ever claimed authorship, but the handwriting matched samples from Reverend Crane's letters. The editor printed it under the headline, Voice from the Grave Hollow. The issue sold out overnight. In 1925, a traveling preacher named Eli Barrow wandered through the remains of Clay Hollow. He wrote a single paragraph about it in his diary. I found the place the locals call the Digger's Rest. The ground there moves like a lung. When I pressed my hand to the soil, it pressed back. He never returned to his circuit. 2 months later, his horse was found tied to a tree near the hollow, still saddled. Reins coiled neat. No sign of Barrow himself except for the faint impression of knees in the earth beside an unmarked pit. Time buried the story as surely as soil. By mid-century, the railroad cut through other mountains, leaving Clay Hollow untouched. Trees reclaimed the land. The river shifted again, and the town vanished from maps. Yet every so often, hikers report strange patterns in the terrain, circular clearings where no trees grow, the soil soft and sweet-smelling, as if freshly turned. Geologists call it coincidence. Locals call it a Fremen's breath. And those who camp overnight there speak of dreams filled with counting, always the same rhythm. 6, 7, 8, 1, then a whisper, measure again. The story of Ephraim Cole was never about death alone, it was about measure how far grief will dig. How deep memory will go before it finds something that should have stayed hidden. Some maps lead to gold, others lead to graves, and a few, like the one carved into the hills of West Virginia, lead to a truth too heavy for the living to carry. When the wind moves through those valleys, it sounds almost like breathing, and if you listen long enough, you'll hear the counting begin again. By the 1930s, Clay Hollow was gone from every map. The government called it a reclaimed zone, condemned after a series of floods, stripped of its name and buried beneath a dam project that never finished. But when the waters receded years later, the valley reappeared. Changed. The trees grew in spirals. The ground bulged like breath. And at the center of it all lay the place once known as Ephraim Cole's cabin, now a crater. Wide as a house, deep as a church, they say the grave he dug never stopped growing. In 1934, a Works Progress Administration crew was sent to chart the reclaimed lands of Clay County. Among them was Thomas Crane, grandson of the Reverend who'd once fled these same hills. He was a quiet man, fond of maps, and had heard his grandfather's stories dismissed, them as superstition, until the day he saw the hollow with his own eyes. The valley was silent. Not dead, the kind of silence that listens. When his men drove stakes into the ground, the earth bled water thick as ink. When they measured distance, their compasses refused to settle. That night, Crane walked the hollow alone. He found the old hearthstone where Ephraim's cabin had stood. Carved into it, still sharp despite the years, were 7 words. The ground remembers who dug it. By spring, the crater bloomed. Thick vines erupted from the soil, curling in strange patterns, 7 rings spiraling inward. Each dawn, the center seemed deeper, darker, as though the ground were sinking by its own will. Local botanists called it impossible. The soil was barren, stripped of seed and ash. Yet the plants grew not toward the sun, but toward the hollow. April 4th found lilies sprouting at the pit's edge, white, but tinted gray as if smoked. Measured growth 1 inch deeper each night. April 7th dreamed of a shovel. Heard it digging beneath my tent. Counted 6 strikes before waking. April 9th, the pit widened. Smells of cedar and iron. Something stirs under the roots. When he sent soil samples to Charleston for testing, they came back stamped organic composition undetermined. Within a month, 2 of his crew had left claiming they heard breathing under the ground while they slept. At the county archives, Thomas found his grandfather's old trunk. Inside lay the cracked spine of Ephraim Cole's ledger. He opened it carefully, pages crumbling like old leaves, and found new writing at the back. Ink too fresh to be a century old. The ground keeps count. Every name is a measure. Every measure a breath. Every breath must be returned. The handwriting matched neither Ephraim's nor the Reverend's. It matched his own. He shut the book and fled the archives that same night. But the damage was done. From that moment on, the hollow began to follow him. By midsummer, strange reports emerged from the dam site. Workers heard voices in the concrete forms, whispers rising through the steel rods before dawn. One said it sounded like counting. Another said he heard a woman weeping through the rebar. When Thomas returned to inspect, the site was empty. No workers remained, only their tools, all lying neatly beside the pit, handles pointing inward. He knelt to pick up a hammer. The ground beneath him shifted, soft as breath. For a moment, he swore he felt a hand pressing back from below. That night, he wrote his final entry. The grave was not for one man. It was a mouth, and we've been feeding it for generations. When Thomas vanished, federal agents arrived to investigate. They found no body, No camp, only a camera. Inside it, one photograph blurred, crooked. Taken in haste. It showed the pit at dusk. The soil glowed faintly, like embers under ash. And at the center stood a man, half turned toward the lens, holding a lantern. His face was obscured, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Stooped shoulders, wide hat, shovel in hand. Years passed. The government abandoned the project, citing unforeseen geological instability. But the land did not rest. Each year, survey planes reported new sinkholes, all in a perfect spiral, expanding outward like a living clock. Old-timers called it the digger's breath, said it marked the rhythm of Ephraim's work, still measuring, still carving through the bedrock of time. When locals tried to fill one of the holes, the dirt refused to settle. They poured truckloads of soil, gravel, even concrete. By morning, every grain was gone. The hole had grown wider. A foreman swore he heard a voice echo up from the depths. "You measure wrong." In 1941, heavy rains hit the valley. The Elk River flooded its banks, drowning the hollow once more. But when the waters drained away, the landscape had changed. Where once there was forest, now lay open ground, perfectly circular, a mile across. From the air, pilots reported, it looked like an enormous eye staring up from the mountainside. At its center, a dark pool. Locals called it the grave that grew. Fish would not live in that water. No frogs sang. Yet at night, travelers on the ridge said they saw ripples, as if something moved beneath the surface, something still digging. Decades later, in 1967, a letter surfaced in the archives of the Charleston Gazette, postmarked but never delivered. It was addressed simply to the Office of Geological Records. No signature. You sealed it wrong. The water cannot keep it. The hollow breathes still. It is no longer one grave, but many, all connected. The bones move. The roots measure. When it opens again, remember this. The first spade was not his. It was hers. The meaning remains unknown, but the handwriting bore a curious mark, the initials RCRU to HCO, hikers and campers who stray too far into the old county still report strange phenomena. Compass, needles spinning. Ground that hums when stepped upon, and at night, the echo of a single patient rhythm, thunk, scrape, pause. Some tell of figures seen near the tree line, a man and a woman, lanterns in hand, moving as one through the mist. Others claim to have found old grave markers rising out of the dirt, names half faded, each newly carved with a date that has not yet come to pass. When they return days later, the markers are gone, only the disturbed soil remains. A few researchers have tried to study the site. One, a geologist named Harper, suggested that the spiral was caused by underground water erosion, until she saw the pattern extended beyond the valley, visible in satellite images as faint rings carved into the earth itself. The same rings appear near other vanished settlements, Ridgeway, Sparrow Creek, and one unnamed site outside Lexington. Each location tied by a single thread. Ephraim Cole once buried someone there. The map, now classified, is known among archivists as the grave pattern. The last line in Harper's notes reads, "The grave was not a place. It was a process." The last dig-in 1972. Flood control crews accidentally unearthed part of the old church foundation near Clay Hollow. They found cedar boards beneath the stone coffin wood. When they lifted one plank, the soil beneath it collapsed, revealing a narrow shaft. They dropped a flare inside. It burned for nearly a minute before hitting bottom. But the flame didn't go out. Instead, the light moved deeper as if being carried away. No one went down after that. The hole was sealed, the site fenced off. But on still nights when the fog crawls low, locals say the ground there pulses like a heartbeat, slow and deep. And if you stand too long, the dirt beneath your boots begins to sink. The grave a man digs for himself is never empty. It fills with everything he's lost, everything he's feared, everything he's refused to let go. For Ephraim Cole, grief was not a wound, it was a root, burrowing ever downward, and what he uncovered was not his wife, nor salvation, but the endless hunger of the earth itself. In the hollow, the soil still breathes, and the counting never stops. Some stories end the way a candle ends a lick of smoke, a last curl of light. Nothing left but the dark. But the story of Ephraim Cole does not end like that. It ends the way a mine ends, with timber groaning in the black, rock settling for 100 years, and something far below still working at the seam. Listen closely. The hollow is awake. The archivist who would not leave in the spring of 1978. A junior archivist named Miriam Dodd opened a carton no one else would touch. The label read, Clay County Misc, fragile. Inside, a warped ledger, 3 water-warped photographs, a rusted shovel head, and a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon. On the ribbon, someone had written, in careful hand, measure again. Miriam was not a believer. She catalogued floods, fires, courthouse ghosts that were nothing but settling beams, but the letters were different. They were addressed to R. Cole and E. Cole. In alternating hands, dates jumped like a skipping. Phonograph, 1895, 1898, 1903, 1934. Then a gap, then 1967. Different paper, different ink. Same message, written and rewritten across decades. The ground keeps time. She took the box home against policy. She told no one. And that night she dreamed of cedar boards, their grains swirling like fingerprint whirls, and of numbers whispered just beyond hearing, 6, 7, 8. 1. On a map, Clay Hollow wears a new name now, a grid square. A flood control sector, a shaded no-build zone. But maps are the gentlest liars. In the real hills, the old road still hooks down through birch and blackgum until the trees thin, and the air turns cold. You can smell iron on the tongue. Penny-sharp. You can feel distance bunch up, as if the miles have gathered in one place to listen. There is a fence, but it lists. There are signs, but the wind has eaten their warnings. And there is still a circle in the earth, not a hole now, but a basin ringed in weed and pale lily, that bloomed toward the center as if the sun rose there. Stand at the lip at dusk, and you will hear it. Thunk. Scrape. Pause. The shovel that never tires. Miriam read by lamplight. The first letter, on brittle paper, signed Ruth Cole. June 11, 1895. Ephraim, the fever is upon me. If I go, do not lie shallow. You know how they are, they listen when the ground talks. Dig deeper than the call, my love. Deeper than the ache. Promise me. The second, same hand, later date. The ink gone thin. August 4th, 1897. You measured wrong, F. You gave me 3 feet too much. It is not the depth that keeps them, it is the circle. I hear them, not angels, not Worms hours. They fall down here like rain. I have tried to hush them with cedar. Come stand at the edge, and you will feel how time slides. Do not be afraid. Dig where the root hums. The third was not signed. It was scratched across the back of a carpenter's bill in a blunt, exhausted hand. October 11th, 1897, measured the ground. It matches me now. Miriam shivered. A clock ticked in her flat. The tick did not line up with the whisper she thought she heard under it. She turned the clock face down. The whisper kept time alone. The photographs were spoiled with damp except one, a long exposure. Dusk soft, ringed and blurred. At the center, a figure with a lantern, half turned. The light making a small sun against a lake of shadow. Along the print's edge, 3 notches, not damage, not chance, measured marks. She took a magnifier to the bottom margin. Tiny, almost a scratch, ECAND, lower. the ghost of a second set of initials crowded beneath it. As if added later in a shaking hand, R.C. Miriam rubbed her eyes until stars burst. When she looked again, the lantern light in the photograph seemed slightly larger. She set the picture down. She did not pick it up again that night. The call that isn't heard, but answered. Archivists learn to doubt their minds early. Paper cuts your memory into strips. Dust makes you see things. Miriam blamed the hour, the old paper, the loneliness of her kitchen. Then the shovel struck. Not in the room, not outside, but somewhere below the floorboards. 3 slow blows against the underwood. She froze. Another 3. Between them. A pause that felt long enough to learn a man's name. She moved toward the sink, without knowing why. The drain smelled faintly of cedar. In her satchel, beneath the letters, she'd brought home a spiral-bound field log from the 1934 survey. Thomas Crane's. She had skimmed it at the office. Now, unsure whether she meant to prove herself a fool or a record keeper, she opened to the last page. There were the words she remembered. The final entry. The grave was not for one man. It was a mouth, but below it, in a scribe's neat hand that was not Thomas Crane's, words kept going, lines she had not seen under the fluorescent wash of work, and it ate time first. Bones after. Names last. The first spade, not his. It was hers. If the ledger closes, the circle opens. If the circle opens, count with it, or be counted. She blinked hard. The ink gleamed like it wasn't yet dry. The return to the scene. She went at dawn. No note on her desk. No call to her supervisor. The letters wrote in her pocket like hot stones. Fog held the road in a white hand, until trees took it back. At the fence, a government chain sagged. She stepped over. The basin opened like a held breath, released. At the lip, she felt it, that small slide in the head when a train goes under the river. A pressure that isn't the ears. The lily turned their gray mouths toward her. Down at the center, the soil shone faintly, as if water had thought about collecting there and changed its mind. Miriam took out the ledger. Inside the cover, in a crease no one had pried, she found a sliver of cedar cut to the length of a grown woman's palm. Along its edge, shallow notches. Counting by 8s. Someone had rubbed each notch with red ochre. Every 7th one was darkened more deeply, as if pressed and pressed again until the wood remembered. She held it like a ruler over the basin. Nothing. Then the ground exhaled. What the earth told. Her asterisk, it did not speak in words. It spoke in a back of the teeth. Hum. A taste of iron, a rhythm older than hymnals. 6 measures. Then 7, then 8, then 1. The beat that haunted the ledger. Only now she understood. They were not numbers, but a circuit. Depths, rings. A way of stepping around something without waking it. And the digger, in grief or wisdom, or both, had stepped wrong. She pictured Ephraim in the fog, tape in hand, lantern burning, the same reluctant son she had seen in the photograph. He had not dug to make a grave. He had dug to lay a loop around time, to set Ruth down where hours slipped past like silt, a place where the fever could not reach, where a night might last forever if a man measured right. But grief dulls the hand. He cut too deep. The loop cracked. Time ran in, then out, then down. When the wind moves through those valleys, it sounds almost like breathing, and if you listen long enough, you'll hear the counting begin again. By the 1930s, Clay Hollow was gone from every map. The government called it a reclaimed zone, condemned after a series of floods, stripped of its name and buried beneath a dam project that never finished. But when the waters receded years later, the valley reappeared. Changed. The trees grew in spirals. The ground bulged like breath. And at the center of it all lay the place once known as Ephraim Cole's cabin, now a crater. Wide as a house, deep as a church. They say the grave he dug never stopped growing. In 1934, a Works Progress Administration crew was sent to chart the reclaimed lands of Clay County. Among them was Thomas Crane, grandson of the Reverend who'd once fled these same hills. He was a quiet man, fond of maps, and had heard his grandfather's stories dismissed, them as superstition, until the day he saw the hollow with his own eyes. The valley was silent. Not dead, the kind of silence that listens. When his men drove stakes into the ground, the earth bled water thick as ink dot when they measured distance. Their compasses refused to settle. That night, Crane walked the hollow alone. He found the old hearthstone where Ephraim's cabin had stood. Carved into it, still sharp despite the years, were 7 words. The ground remembers who dug it. By spring, the crater bloomed. Thick vines erupted from the soil, curling in strange patterns, 7 rings spiraling inward. Each dawn, the center seemed deeper, darker, as though the ground were sinking by its own will. Local botanists called it impossible. The soil was barren, stripped of seed and ash. Yet the plants grew not toward the sun, but toward the hollow. April 4th found lilies sprouting at the pit's edge, white, but tinted gray as if smoked. Measured growth 1 inch deeper each night. April 7th dreamed of a shovel. Heard it digging beneath my tent. Counted 6 strikes before waking. April 9th, the pit widened. Smells of cedar and iron. Something stirs under the roots. When he sent soil samples to Charleston for testing, they came back stamped organic composition undetermined. Within a month, 2 of his crew had left, claiming they heard breathing under the ground while they slept out at the county archives. Thomas found his grandfather's old trunk. Inside lay the cracked spine of Ephraim Cole's ledger. He opened it carefully, pages crumbling like old leaves, and found new writing at the back. Ink too fresh to be a century old. The ground keeps count. Every name is a measure. Every measure a breath. Every breath must be returned. The handwriting matched neither Ephraim's nor the Reverend's. It matched his own. He shut the book and fled the archives that same night. But the damage was done. From that moment on, the hollow began to follow him. By midsummer, strange reports emerged from the dam site. Workers heard voices in the concrete forms, whispers rising through the steel rods before dawn. One said it sounded like counting. Another said he heard a woman weeping through the rebar. When Thomas returned to inspect, the site was empty. No workers remained, only their tools, all lying neatly beside the pit, handles pointing inward. He knelt to pick up a hammer. The ground beneath him shifted, soft as breath. For a moment, he swore he felt a hand pressing back from below. That night, he wrote his final entry. The grave was not for one man. It was a mouth, and we've been feeding it for generations. When Thomas vanished, federal agents arrived to investigate. They found no body, no camp, only a camera. Inside it, one photograph blurred, crooked, taken in haste. It showed the pit at dusk. The soil glowed faintly, like embers under ash. And at the center stood a man, half turned toward the lens, holding a lantern. His face was obscured, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Stooped shoulders, wide hat, shovel in hand. Years passed. The government abandoned the project, citing unforeseen geological instability. But the land did not rest. Each year, survey planes reported new sinkholes, all in a perfect spiral, expanding outward like a living clock. Old-timers called it the digger's breath, said it marked the rhythm of Ephraim's work, still measuring, still carving through the bedrock of time. When locals tried to fill one of the holes, the dirt refused to settle. They poured truckloads of soil, gravel, even concrete. By morning, every grain was gone. The hole had grown wider. A foreman swore he heard a voice echo up from the depths. "You measure wrong." In 1941, heavy rains hit the valley. The Elk River flooded its banks, drowning the hollow once more. But when the waters drained away, the landscape had changed. Where once there was forest, now lay open ground, perfectly circular, a mile across. From the air, Pilots reported it looked like an enormous eye staring up from the mountainside. At its center, a dark pool. Locals called it the grave that grew. And the hollow learned to breathe. The thing in the cedar, she crouched. The soil at the center was dry as ash on top, wet as blood beneath. When she touched it, her finger came back smelling of damp wood. For a second, ridiculous and sure, she felt that a plank lay under her skin. Something wooden shifted far below, a creak like pews settling between verses. Then, very softly, a voice, not in her ear, not in her head, but in the space somewhere her name could fit if someone decided to speak it. Measure again. She almost ran. Instead, she did what archivists do. She recorded. She laid the cedar slip flat, counted the notches aloud, felt foolish, counted again. On the seventh notch, the basin tightened, the air cooled, and heat rose under her feet as if a stove door had swung open below. She took the letters from her pocket and placed them on the ground in order. 1895, 1897, 1967. She read Ruth's plea. She read Ephraim's confession. Then she read the anonymous line. The first spade was not his. It was hers. Miriam looked at the earth and thought of a woman with fever trying to save her husband from drowning in days, of a man trying to save her back, both of them cutting circles in different nights. The pit had not been a grave. It had been a bargain. The bargain comes due. The shovel struck. Close. 3 blows. Pause. Something had climbed within hearing. Miriam spoke, because silence would make her scream. I'm not the one you measured. The pause lengthened, not confusion, but consideration. Who keeps the book? Not words. Meaning, I do. Then close it. The ground all around made the sound that a book's spine makes after 50 years, a sigh, a crack, a setting back in. And she understood the last instruction in Thomas Crane's field log. If the ledger closes, the circle opens. But the hand that had added the warning count with it, or be counted, had been scratched in later, likely by someone who had seen the circle open and lived long enough to write. She lifted the ledger. It went heavy in her arms, as if water had soaked it in an instant. When she tried to close it, the damp swelled the pages. Measure again. This time the meaning sharpened. With me. She pressed the cedar slip against the spine. 7th notch marked with ochre. The ledger settled. The air tightened. The basin's lily bowed as if to a procession. Miriam looked down and saw, for the first time, that the center was not soil but wood, a face of cedar planed as smooth as skin, a hollowness as strict and perfect as a held note. Somewhere below, a lantern breathed, the witness at the lip when she stood. Someone stood opposite her across the basin, a man in a hat, shoulders bent, lantern cupped to the wind. His face was not visible. Light ate it, but his posture carried a tired courtesy she knew from the letters. A man who thanked the soil for the work it allowed. Ephraim, she said. The lantern lifted. Not quite a nod. I have your book. He made no move to take it. The shovel stayed low at his side. Blade turned toward himself like a mirror. Thunk, scrape, pause. Each strike echoed under her feet. A breath, later a chamber answering a chamber. I cannot close it, she said, almost a plea. Not by myself. The lantern dimmed, then flared. When it flared, she saw a second figure standing a step behind him. Hand on his sleeve, a woman in plain dress, hair tied in ribbon. Her other hand rested on the handle of her own spade. Half uplifted, the first spade, the one that had started the circle, not in error, but in love. Ruth. They did not speak. They only set their shovels together and cut an invisible notch in the air between them, as if measuring her where she stood, not to bury, but to include. The earth took that measure, accepted it. Miriam understood then what the circle wanted, not the end of a line, but its joining. An archivist to keep the count, a kof, voice to tell the edges where to meet. The circle opens when the ledger finally shut in her hands. The basin did not collapse or explode or swallow her. It widened by a breath. Lily shivered. A sound rose from below like a choir singing one note forever, for a moment. Every grave in the county old, forgotten, proud with marble, or marked with only a stone, seemed to take that note and pass it along. A circle of breath, relayed from hill to hill, a ring that did not end. Far under her. Wood shifted. A new seam opened. Not to let something escape, to make room. Count with it. Or be counted. She began to count, not aloud, not in seconds, but in measures set by the pause between blows. 6, 7, 8, 1. Around her, the hollows answered without words. Flood scars, mine seams, cellar holes, fox dens, all those places where the ground already knew how to give and take. When she reached one, the ledger in her hands grew warm, then cool. The whisper in the drain at home, the cedar in the sink, the knocks under the floor, all of it slotted into place. This was not haunting. It was maintenance. The archivist returned. Miriam walked out at noon, eyes rimmed with soil, ledger clasped to her chest like a hymnal. On the highway, trucks roared. In town, a child cried for candy. The present held. At her desk, she wrote one entry, then locked the box and signed the transfer slip that would bury the carton again. The ledger is closed for now. The circle is open and holds. The breath continues. If you open this without counting, the ground will count you. If you count with it, you will hear them, not the dead, but the hours we lost. Keep them. Keep time. She dated it, initialed it, and slid it in among the Ruth and Ephraim letters where a future hand might find it and choose. At home, she turned the clock back to the wall. The whisper under the tick fit now. It had not changed. She had what we know, what we tell. This is what remains fit to speak aloud. Man dug a grave that would not stay put. A woman taught the ground to hold what illness stole. A preacher tried to warn us and fled. A grandson was measured and did not know it. A surveyor vanished where maps go, blind, and an archivist came back with a book and a way to listen. Hollow never sleeps. It does not want you. It does not hate you. It asks only that someone keep the count, so the circle holds, so the hours lost to fever and flood and mine can be kept somewhere. That is not cruelty. If you go there at dusk, and you should not, but if you do, you may see two lanterns move slow along the lip, crossing like minute and hour. You may hear 3 blows of a shovel, and the small silence that follows. And if your heart falls into step with it, if you feel your breath borrow the rhythm, you will know the truth that frightened the reverend and steadied the widow. This was never a story about death. It was a story about time, and those who loved enough to hold it down.